Good. Welcome to OSP 301, Integrating SharePoint with Azure. And this is a 300 level session. I'm assuming you're all developers, or most of you? Yeah? Good, okay. If not, I'll try and explain things along the way. But for the most part, what I've done in this session is to break it out into 4 pieces. My name is Steve Fox, by the way, and if you have any questions afterwards, you can ping me via mail or see my blog for more information. I wanted to break it down into 4 pieces because I think these are kind of the questions I'm getting a lot from different customers and developers in the community. I'm going to cover services, I'm going to cover data, remote access, and we're going to cover security as well. And what that means is, in terms of service, we'll talk a bit about how I can take a WCF service, deploy it into Windows Azure, and consume it within SharePoint. In terms of data, I'll walk through an example where we show you some blob data, how you consume it both in a web part and in Silverlight. We'll talk about remote access. I'll walk through how you build a Windows Phone 7 app that you can actually access SharePoint on-premises data via Windows Azure. And then finally, we'll talk a bit about security. Security is a little bit of a rabbit hole right now, but we'll jump into it and talk about the different things that you can do at present. So let's kick it off by talking a bit about why. First thing before I go any further, how many people are SharePoint developers? Okay, a good percentage of you. And how many people are familiar with what Windows Azure is? Okay, so roughly most of you. So my assumption is that you know a bit about SharePoint, you know a bit about Windows Azure. Given the fact that this is 300, we'll kind of make that assumption. But the point is, why do you want to bring these 2 technologies together, right? And I'm sure you've heard it in the keynote, you may have heard it in the foundational sessions, maybe some other Windows Azure sessions. There's this cost optimization model for leveraging Azure. Now what that means is if I want to store big blobs, video files, for example, on premises, I might run up against a storage wall. If I want to put them out into Azure, I get the usage models, I get the scalability model, I don't have to chase hardware around, right? So that's one example. There's certainly other examples in terms of deploying services, not having to pay 100% of the cost of a basically hardware in order to run it. You're basically the pay-per-use model in the cloud. But that's kind of the cost optimization model. Now, that's more for the business folks, and I know that people in this room, seeing as you're more probably implementers and developers, you're probably interested in terms of what you can do from a pragmatic standpoint from the coding perspective. And so the why becomes, how can I take my services and make them more broadly available? How can I plug into worker roles that plug into further third-party services? How can I take data and have cloud-based BI solutions, right? Think about, I showed an example on Monday where we had the Contoso Oil and Gas, and all those gas stations were pushing transactions into the cloud. Again, you're not worried about your server behind the firewall trying to accrue all those transactions. You're putting them out into the cloud and then leveraging Azure and SharePoint for a dashboard to tap into that data. Okay, so those different types of scenarios in and around services and data that help you bridge on-premises and the cloud. And the last one here, which is an important one as we roll out the Office 365 beta, is parity. Right? So we're seeing a lot of questions around how can I build an application that works both for SharePoint and for Office 365 but still leverages Windows Azure within that architecture. Okay, so this is kind of the why and the place I'm starting from. So the first part of the cube here is talking about services, and what we'll do here is I'm going to walk you through a solution that essentially does the following. It's going to have a web part. I'm going to show you both a web part and a Silverlight application. It's going to consume a WCF service that's deployed into Windows Azure. Okay? It's then going to be calling data, querying data from the Windows Azure Marketplace data market, okay, which is a great way to get started with Windows Azure. It's going to pull some data back and it's going to expose it out into a web part. Okay? The fundamentals here, service in basically deployed to Windows Azure, querying data, but all of my kind of artifacts, my SharePoint artifacts that live, they're going to live inside of SharePoint. Okay? You'll see on the right-hand side, that's kind of the process I follow. Choose my data source inside of Windows Azure. I figure out what I'm going to do with my WCF service. What does it look like? I'll deploy that into Azure, create a Silverlight app or a web part. Then I'll deploy that into SharePoint in some way, shape, or form. The nice thing here is with Silverlight, you obviously have the extensibility with the SharePoint client object model. And of course, if you have a web part, you have the server object model there as well. So that's kind of the first demo. So what I'll do is I'll pop over into code. Actually, let's do this first. Let's go into my other laptop here. So I wanted to show you the first thing here. This is the Azure Data Market And this is essentially the data source that we'll work with in this example. For those of you who haven't seen this before, let me see here. Let's just put on Zoom it so you can go ahead and see some stuff. If you haven't been here before, basically datamarket.azure.com. You can use your live ID to get a key, a developer key, and basically be up in minutes. What I've got, if you look and click on My Data, you'll see that I've got some different sources that I've added to my account. I go down here, data.gov is one of the different sources of data that I use. You can see that if we go down, we've got different ways in which we can consume that data. Okay, I can consume it via the web browser. That's just by clicking Explore this data set. I can use Power Pivot, Tableau software. I can basically create classes on the fly and pull that into my Visual Studio projects. Now, for this particular example, let's just take a look at what this data looks like. Okay, so let's explore the data set. This is the UI in which you can explore the data set. This is basically, we're going to add Washington as our filter. Click Run Query. Basically what's happening is there's going to be this restified data source that's being queried and pulled back, and this is the results of that data. Okay, you can see here that on the basically the display here, I've got state, city, year, population, et cetera, et cetera. You know, and this is really just test data. That's all I would see this as because it's not very up to date. But the point of the data market is to get subscription data out there so people can consume that data. It should be current with some of the other sources. Now, one of the other key things I'll show you here is the fact that when you translate this into XML, this is what you're going to be pulling back and parsing, right? Because you can literally take a REST URI, call in that data, pull it back, and then parse that out and expose that in a web part or in a Silverlight application, which would live inside of SharePoint. Now, for me, because I want parity across SharePoint on premises and Office 365, I'm actually going to deploy my web service to Windows Azure. That's why, right? And so I have most of my code executing in the cloud, but then part of it living in SharePoint for the first example. Okay? So the other thing I'll show you, click Develop. This is the REST URI that I have here that'll basically be embedded inside an HTTP web request. Okay? And I'll use that to go out and query the data. Okay? That's in a nutshell what we're going to be doing in terms of the data source. If anybody has any questions, by the way, just shout them out. I really don't mind interactive discussions, okay? All right, so first things first, if we hop into Visual Studio, click New Project, the first thing I really want to do is I want to build out a WCF service, right? That WCF service has to allow me to call in and work with the crime data. I'm going to go here and click Cloud Project. For those of you who haven't seen this, these are the tools that are installed when you install the Windows Azure SDK. I can go here and click TechEd WCF service if I wanted to. Click OK. That's going to essentially create a project structure for me. If you look over on the right-hand side, we can see there's a bunch of goo there. Let's just see that. It's finished. Yep, there we go. You can see that there's two main parts to this solution. The top part is the service and all the constituent parts of the service. The bottom is basically the Windows Azure wrapper, right? That allows us the configuration to actually get the code and have it execute inside of Azure, okay? There's a number of things that we can do here to create this service. For example, I can go ahead and let's do this. Let's kill the existing contract and get rid of that stuff there. Go down here. Kill that. Go up here. Great. I'll just get my operation contract in there. There's going to be a couple things. Basically, what I'll be doing here is I will be getting all the crime data, okay? And so I'm going to need a custom object here. So I'll go ahead and add a class in here as well. Let's go add a new class. Okay, add the new class. Here we go. Add a custom data object. This is basically representative of a subset of that data that I'm bringing back from the Azure Data Market, okay? So I only want a certain portion of it because I don't want all of it. Then I can go back into my service class here, and then I can begin to build out my service file, my class code, service class code. So we'll go here, a couple of class variables. Now here you can see, and I'm just taking that, basically that REST URI. It's going to be my Dallas URL, and it's basically going to be passed in again. It's going to be wrapped in a web request object. It's going to be sent over the wire, and it's going to pull that data back. Now here is where I could put a key. I'm going to hop and do the Julia Childs thing here in just a sec, but I'll show you. It's basically just a string. And here is another thing. It's just a string as well, account ID. You get both of these when you actually sign up for the Windows Azure account. I'll go down here, and then I'll just add the crime data method. We'll just open that up. Now, of course, you guys are all very smart developers, so you're going to take a lot of this, the parsing code, and you'll optimize it with LINQ. But literally what I'm doing here is just grabbing a web request, going through with my HTTP response, and just parsing out that data that's coming back. This data here, I think, is pretty ugly, but again, you guys can optimize this code to pull that data back, run through, and eventually what you get is you get a return object, which is a list collection of my crime data. Let me see, let me just zoom in on that a little bit so folks can see that in the back. That's essentially what you're pulling back, right? And you're returning the list of crimes in Washington. Okay? Simply put, query URI, or the REST URI pulls that data back, and I'm basically going to push it back into any calling application. In this case, there's two calling applications, right? There's one that's a web part, and there's one that's a Silverlight application. Okay? Are you all with me so far? Okay? All right, so now here's where we do the Julia Childs thing, and I'll pop over into something I've already created. This is TechEd D1. The one thing I didn't show you when I actually created that service is here's my service. Same thing. The one thing is I've actually added a couple of XML files here. You'll see I've got a client policy file and cross-domain file. The reason I'm doing this is because when you deploy a service into Azure and you have Silverlight calling it, you need a cross-domain policy file so it'll actually succeed, okay? If you don't do that, then you'll get this weird error that's a permissions error, and the call won't go through for you. The other thing that you'll need to do is when you're actually building out this service, when we go here, here's where we want to publish it. Go publish. You can create your service package. This is where we begin to take that code and then publish it into Windows Azure. Okay? Because the point is, we're taking this code and having it run in a data center somewhere off in the world. And this just takes us, it builds out these two files for us. It's a config file here and a package file. And this is where we go into our management portal. Here you can see that I've already got my TechEd role here all set up and ready to go. And all I would do is click Upgrade, and I would click Browse Locally. I would take the package that I've just built and go ahead, and I would add the service package, browse locally, add publish, and of course, add the service configuration. And I'm not going to click OK, because we'll sit here for 10 minutes while it churns away. But I click OK, it would then refresh, and eventually you would get this ready status here that would say, OK, the service is now ready to use. And when it's ready to use, what that looks like is we can go over here, and here's my service. And you can see by the URL of the service endpoint, it's got my TechEd 2011 namespace, .cloud, yada, 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 yada. So the point is, I now have code, a service that's executing or could execute from the cloud, from within Windows Azure, that's pulling data from my Azure Data Marketplace, okay? You all with me so far? Any questions on this? No? Okay, good. All right, so at this point, I've built out my service, I've deployed it, now I'm ready to consume it within different artifacts within SharePoint. Let's go back to our project here, and we can see that if I wanted to essentially pull this into a web part, first of all, we'll do a very simple web part. What I can do is, most of you are familiar with this, if you're SharePoint developers, I can basically add a SharePoint empty project, and on that empty SharePoint project, I can basically come in here and add a web part. So add new item, add visual web part, click add, we're away. Now if we take a look at this web part, I'll just click View Designer. Basically what you're going to see here is just a very simple UI. It's going to be a data grid with a button. Okay? I know this is very design-centric. You're kind of blown away, but don't worry. It gets more complicated. If you look at the code behind, right, you can see that what we're doing here is one of the things I constantly see over the blogs is the web.config configuration. So I've basically added a service reference. Let's just pump that up a little bit. And you can see that I'm using basic HTTP binding and using that URI, the service endpoint that points to my project or my service that I've deployed into Windows Azure. I'm calling the get crime data, passing in a null value. I could pass a state, but I'm just basically hard-coded that into the URI. Then I'm going through and using an in-memory object to create a list collection. Again, you could optimize this code a little bit based on the service reference, but in this case, I'm kind of being a little more explicit. And essentially, at the end of it, I'm left with this, this return crime data from service, basically the data coming back that I just data bind the data grid. And really, all I need to do at that point is go back to my project and go right-click and deploy. that's basically going to deploy that web part into SharePoint as a native feature of SharePoint. And if we jump into the other, hopefully you can see this, what that looks like is we go over here. This is very complex, I know. We click that, but it calls the service that's deployed in Windows Azure. And so now what we have is we have a web part. It's fairly simple, but all that code is executing within Windows Azure. Okay? Now, key thing here, this is not portable. I couldn't take this particular application and cross-apply it to Office 365. Can anybody tell me why? Sandbox solutions, but there is a visual web part that is a sandbox solution, but the point is if you try and put this in Office 365, in web parts and sandbox solutions, you can't make external service calls, okay? Hence the need for Silverlight. And so this is the second example, right? If we jump back, and I'll show you the example where we have Silverlight here, what I've built out is a nice little Silverlight app. Again, the new up process is add new project. Go ahead, Silverlight application. I didn't use the web host that comes along with it. But what I did do was have a little fancier UI this time. So this is where things get a little more, not necessarily complicated, but a little more fun. What I'm doing here is I'm actually going to take some of that data back, and I'm going to accrue it and aggregate it into some summaries that I'm then going to expose in the, not in that one. Let's do this. Here we go. And that's not what I wanted. There we go here. Let's just do this for now. I've got a toolkit chart that I'm using that's basically, I'm just going to push some data into there so I get a little bit of BI there. I like the toolkit chart. It's really nice. Refreshes nice. It looks good. You can theme it with the toolkit. I don't know how many people are using Silverlight, but it's a nice way to actually build out a decent looking UI without too much work up front design-wise. So that's kind of my UI. Of course, if you look down here, I've got a little button. That's obviously where my event's going to be hanging off of. You'll see I've got my service reference. I've added that in, to the actual WCF service that lives in the cloud. I go ahead and click main page here, and you can see that. Here's the code behind. If we walk down the tree, first of all, we'll start off. I've got a return crime data. Again, that same object that I'm basically just creating a list collection. And I'm going ahead and going to use that to essentially have an in-memory object. I've got some integer values that'll be my summaries when I take back and add some of those up. And then you can see that now I'm calling out my proxy. And because this is a Silverlight, we have to make asynchronous calls. And the bulk of the work is done down here inside of my get crime data completed. And you can see there I'm taking the var, my crime data, associating that with the results that are coming back, and then again I'm iterating through. Again, you guys might find more optimal ways to just spin through the data and package it up in a way that you can data bind. And the last thing I do here is I obviously apply the item source to the return data list collection. The last thing I do is go down here, and this is where you populate the chart. So here you can see I'm calling the populate pie chart, passing in some dictionaries of int and strings. That's going to set up that chart with those summaries for me that I can then go ahead and just nicely populate when the service is called. Okay? Now there's a couple different ways that you can basically take this and push it into SharePoint. Paul Stubbs, who's sitting in the back, put together a Silverlight and SharePoint web part project for us, and it's in the V6 gallery. A great way where you can basically just package up a Silverlight file and deploy it as a native web part within SharePoint. Another way I'm going to do here is just package it up as a ZAP file and stick it in the document library. Super simple. The real reason I do that is then I can push it into a ZAP's document library within SharePoint Online as well, right? So again, I'm trying to reach this parity, and then we can go from there and use it in both. So I build it out. Go ahead, then I'll open it up. Open up the folder. Grab the app. Debug. Whatever. This is where the ZAP file lives, so I'm just going to grab that. And then when I go back to my SharePoint site, I just have my ZAPs living here. I go ahead and add the document there, and I copy the shortcut, and then I'll just add it as the Silverlight Media web part. Okay? Just using that shortcut. You've all done that, right? It's a fairly simple, out-of-the-box process that gets you a nice little a Silverlight application. And here's the result, right? Now I have my US crime data. I can go here, go down. I click the Get Data button. That then calls the service that lives in Azure, that grabs the data from Azure, but then it exposes it in the Silverlight web part. And you can see that the helper function there that basically totaled all the crime data in Washington just basically populated that chart for me. And so we can see here that property is the biggest crime in Washington as opposed to violent and robbery and burglary. So that's a good thing, right? Yep. Yep. How am I accessing it? Okay, so I skipped a step there. Basically, if we go back, the question was, how am I accessing this document or this ZAP file from the document library? Let's go like this. Copy the shortcut, go into crime. I'll go page, edit the page, add a web part. And this is where I was saying I was using the native Silverlight web part. Click Silverlight web part, click add, bada bing, bada boom. There's your ZAP file. And you, of course, have to resize it. And this is why the other reason, if you check out the Silverlight and SharePoint web part, you can actually resize it programmatically, which makes a bit more sense, right? Then you can get things adjusted before you deploy it into SharePoint. Now, the other thing here is basically if you look at this guy here, you can see that here is, this is an internal beta of Office 365 that Microsoft is running. These are spsites.microsoft.com. So this is Office 365. I've done the same thing. And so I'm running this same application. Let's just go ahead and refresh this. I'm running the same application. Click Get Data. And you can suppress this. Let me go ahead and does the same thing. Okay? So now we have an application that's Silverlight mediated in this case, but it has parity across SharePoint and Office 365, but heavily leverages the Windows Azure service and data on the back end. Okay? Make sense? Okay. Is that kind of getting the juices flowing a little bit in terms of the things that you can do? The other thing that I didn't mention before is one of the things that you're actually doing here is you're actually getting code off the server, right? Which your admins could like, right? They, how developers are always running everything that's admins and putting code on the server. This is one way of actually getting code off of the server and still being able to run it with some degree of efficiency. Okay. Let's go back to our slides. This is a summary here. Some other possibilities, right? Lots of possibilities when it comes to service. You can reuse the Windows Azure Data Marketplace as an endpoint, create your own. The worker roles within Windows Azure, you can have those running all the time that are kind of getting information. It could be a stock information or flight information that would then inform workflow on the SharePoint side of things. So don't ever think that it's just about a little Silverlight app that goes and grabs some data. You can have data that's kind of, or services that are working all the time. And of course, there's lots of things that you can do in terms of parity across SharePoint and Office 365. So the second example I wanted to show you here is about data. And what I wanted to do was, because we're looking a lot at how can we build out these little training solutions or image applications that you're taking these large-scale files or large-size files, and you don't want to have them on premises servers, right? You want to get them off and be able to access them. And what are the ways in which we can do that? So what I'm going to show you here is, first of all, we'll start out with a Windows Azure default ASP.NET page, just basically a fairly simple ASP page that will allow you to upload blobs into blob storage. Okay? There's my blob storage. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to do two things. Again, along the spirit of having Silverlight and web parts along side by side so you can see what is parity, what isn't, I'm going to have a web part, but it's going to expose it as an iframe. What that means, though, is my website lives in Windows Azure, but then I can expose it through an iframe inside of SharePoint. Now, you may think that's cheating a little bit, but actually, you can do some interesting things there by putting it in an iframe. For example, now you can tap into ACS version 2 security, and you can actually secure that website through an iframe. So you can do some interesting things there. A little more difficult in other regards. I'll also have a Silverlight application that talks directly to blob storage, grabs some information, and exposes certain images, and then pushes it into a SharePoint list so you can see that there's some bridge work working with the SharePoint list. Okay? This will be the second demo. Again, how did I go about doing it? First of all, I created the upload page. I'll create an iframe web part. We'll create a Silverlight viewer for the blobs, and we'll deploy both the web part and Silverlight to SharePoint so you can see how that works. Okay? Obviously, there's other things that you can do in terms of extensibility, using, again, the client object model and other things there as well. Okay? So let's jump into it. Where were we? Okay, so let's kill this here because I don't think we need this. And first of all, let's look at the Azure Manager. So this is basically, if we go into add a new project, you'll see a cloud project here. If you click OK, basically what happens is we have the ASP.NET web role. We click that. That actually generates a default.aspx for us, okay? Standard, most of you who are coding SharePoint are probably familiar with ASP.NET controls. I'm going to assume that. And so if you go ahead and take a look at the default.aspx page, you'll see that there's just a bunch of standard controls here, okay? We've got image path, so it's allowing us to grab a file, image name. We can associate a category with it, and then that submit image link button is where I'll actually click something. It'll take the blob, it'll push it into blob storage. And then anything I have up in blob storage, I can actually take a look at what's in there, and then I can begin to data bind it to have some information about what's in blob storage so I can see what's actually there. Now, those are essentially the controls. If we look at the code behind, I just can't go through all of this. What I will do is I will post this code. There's a lot of stuff here, but I think the net is twofold here. First of all, I'm using the .NET assemblies here that go along with this particular library right here. It is the storage client library, so if you want to do this, you can literally take this assembly and put it into all sorts of projects, and you can access the API. The other thing, though, is that basically the .NET assemblies, the .NET libraries, are just wrappers for REST URIs that you can use with blob storage as well. Blob storage, to me, in Windows Azure is one of the more, I think, flexible parts of Windows Azure because you have a different security model. You have both .NET and REST access when you're programming against blob storage. So it's nice when you're actually programming. So here, let's just quickly walk through this code again. I don't want to get too bogged down. You can see that at the top. Let's go ahead here. At the top, I've got some objects I need to set up. In the context of blob storage, we have a namespace, a container, and blobs inside that container, okay? And so when we go through and create a container, we have to create a container, an account, we have to have permissions against that account, and blobs that would, basically be contained inside that account. The update image list here, again, I've got some comments. I'm not going to go through everything, but you can see here that, I'm grabbing the list of blobs, iterating through them so I can populate that data grid, okay? I want you to be able to see what I've got in there so I know whether I can delete something or add something, all right? You can see I'm using a lot of vars here, but you could equally use vars or explicit objects if you want to do. And let's go down. Again, I will post this code because I don't think it's fair for me to just run through this super quickly and have you guys get dizzy because I'm going too far down. Here is where we've got the cloud storage account that I'm setting up. Basically, when you're communicating with blob storage, you need a data connection string, and that's what this guy is right here. So cloud storage.parse gets the data connection string. It can be your local dev account, or it can be the Windows Azure account that you can put in there. And of course, going down even further, we've got a row command handler, which basically just handles the delete command. So I want to delete image. It goes ahead and just goes through, finds the one I want to delete, and just deletes it. And then, of course, I just call the update image list again to refresh the data grid. And if we go down again, this is one of the more important methods because here's where I actually submit. And let's just pull this down here. The other ones are just smaller helper functions. I go ahead, I get the current date, get the video file extension, some other information that I want to create that URI out of. Then I upload from stream, which is basically taking that file that we clicked in the box. Then I'm going to take that and push that up with some metadata. And I'm using an in-memory object to help me along here, and then grabbing some properties and pushing that up as well. And again, I call the update image list, and well, if you don't know what I'm doing when I call clear text box fields, then we're all in trouble, right? So anyways, that's what I'm doing here. In terms of deploying this, right, there's a couple of ways in which I can deploy this. Because this is a project that I can deploy directly into Azure, I just go published and follow the same process I did before. And then I get a URL inside of my Windows developer portal that I can click on, and it's like, hey, here's your page. Now again, you probably want to expose that inside the context of SharePoint in a couple different ways, and you can absolutely do that. The first way would be if I want to create a new project, right? Again, you can go ahead, add a new project. This project this time is a SharePoint empty project, and I could basically add a simple web part, and this would be the code. It's fairly simple to create an iframe web part. Let's just, so you can see the whole thing. Here, just create a string builder, and then I'm just throwing in this iframe, which points to the specific location of that default.aspx page. Okay? Now again, you may think, oh, that's kind of cheating. But in one sense, it's allowing you to do some different, you don't have to, again, put the code on the SharePoint server. It still executes. You can take files locally and put them into blob storage. So you still have that interaction with SharePoint at a certain level. You can also secure this using ACS. So let's go back and just kill that. And then again, literally all I would do is go back here and go right-click and deploy. And it would deploy as a web part into SharePoint that would then look like, let's go ahead. Let's do this. It would look like this. Go back here, stop editing. Let's browse back and go up to home. This is blob. What will happen here, this is the iframe that's loading. And you can see that this is an iframe. But I can go ahead, click browse, go to, let's say, I don't know, pictures, hit graph, hit open. Image name, graph, technical, submit image, and that basically takes that and submits it into, and then updates my data grid, submits it into Windows Azure. So basically now, from within this iframe, I'm pushing data into blob storage. Now, this is, again, through an iframe, but you could literally archive data if you wanted to from a workflow. You could take, if you've got 50 versions of a document, take 35 of them, push them into Windows blob storage, to optimize storage on premises, things like that. So there's lots of ways of using blob storage. And if we go ahead and just take a look at what's in there, you can see that there's the boy and gift PNG. And again, it's Fabricam legal, so this is a namespace that's actually living in the cloud. So this is actual blobs that I have coming in and out of my application here. Well, that's that. Now, once I have it in there, I'll show you the viewer first, then we'll go back and show you how you create it. Now I've got the Silverlight viewer. So think about this. If I have videos, and I'm pushing videos into blob storage, and I want to play them in some way, shape, or form. Training solutions, for example. You could store your metadata in SharePoint, but have your video files actually stored in Windows Azure. So again, you're offsetting the cost of those large files. Here you can see that if I go ahead and click Load Images, this is actually going to call a service that's deployed in Windows Azure, grab some information from blob storage using the REST APIs, pull it back, and it'll expose to me a bunch of images. And I can go here and say, OK, boy and gift, great. Boy picnic, et cetera, all these images that I've pushed up there. That I can go, oh, well, coolness factor, well, I don't know, maybe 4. Not sure. And we'll click Save. And then that'll allow us to actually push information into a list. If you go back here to Azure Images, there's our list, boy picnic, some information. So the point is, now I've got this ability to not only view information, but because we're using Silverlight, I have the client object model that can push information back or pull information from SharePoint as well. OK? So what I'll do now is I'll just jump back into the project and very quickly show you the Silverlight side of things. Because again, I showed you the web part. And the first thing is, again, we're using it in basically a WCF service. And we're deploying that into Windows Azure. We've got an HTTP web request. It's that URL. Remember I told you that because we're using blob storage, we can use REST against it. Okay? And this is the REST URI that I'm going out and grabbing some information. It allows me to grab those, some information about what I've got there to grab the links. I can go down, and I've got X documents, all the kind of typical parsing methods that would then allow me to just return that data back to the calling application. If you go ahead and then look at the Silverlight image viewer, it's using that service that I've deployed into Azure. Okay? Take a look at the main page here. Again, this is the same application you saw. If you look at the code behind, we have an image info internal class object that we're using, some string variables. And if we go down, you can see that there's just a proxy, and we are going through and much doing the same thing. We're just going through, getting some information, and pulling that back. Let's do this rather than trying to futz around with that guy. Any questions while I'm fixing the font here? Yep. Whoever. So the question was, how about the debugging experience? So there's basically, there's two sides of this, right? There's the SharePoint debugging, and then there's the cloud debugging, right? And so most of you are probably familiar with the SharePoint debugging. You have F5 debugging with any SharePoint artifact, like a web part. Of course, you can hook Silverlight in and kind of do that as well. For debugging in the cloud, there are special APIs that you can call into to do debugging and tracing and things like that. You just kind of have to explicitly work with that API to do that in the cloud, okay? The way in which typically I'll go about debugging some of the stuff on premises, if you look at this service here, if you go here, I always, even though you can wrap the service with an Azure project, you can literally just deploy it into your local IIS and begin to test that service out first locally, with a WinForm, a console app, something like that, to make sure, it's actually working. And then I would deploy it out and begin to build it out that way. You'll save yourself a little bit of time, because it takes you 10 or 15 minutes to upload things to Windows Azure, and you don't want to have to cycle through that same 10, 15 minutes every time you want to debug something. But the point is, there's an API that allows you to do that. And was that the question? Yeah, you? No, I think isn't there a new streaming service from Windows Azure? I'll check on it and maybe blog about it, but I think there's a new streaming service. But I don't think no is probably the answer, but let me check on it for you. Yeah. Okay, where was I? So yeah, jumping back into the image viewer, now we've got the code all a little bigger here. You can see that we're running through, again, using an X document, and then basically, if you change the selection, it just populates some of the controls and allows you to actually visualize that image. Very simple stuff, but the powerful thing is I could take this Silverlight, again, this Silverlight object, and put it in Office 365 or have it in SharePoint on premises. A lot of that code, again, is executing in the cloud. Okay? All right. So we're running pretty quickly here through all this stuff. Any questions before I move on to the next example? Yep. That's a great question. So the question, is there a resource that maps out what's right or best practices for either Office 365 or SharePoint on premises? There is a developer guide, a SharePoint Online developer guide that recently came out. I don't have the exact URL in my head, but you could go to our favorite web search engine, bing.com, and you could find it just by putting SharePoint Online developer guide. And you can ping me on offline if you can't find it. I'll send you the exact URL. But so there is, and I think we have to do more work there, though, to help you along. And that'll come as we get further in the beta and into Office 365. OK, so 538 here. All right, so let's jump back to our slides here. So lots of stuff. So I just showed you blob data. Tomorrow morning, we're going to do some Office and Azure stuff, and I'll walk through how you do SQL Azure. So literally, if you put data, SQL Azure is basically the relational counterpart to SQL Server, but it's in the cloud. You could build some very interesting relational databases and BI solutions against SQL Azure data. It's interesting there because it's natively integrated with external content types. So what that means is I don't have to really do any code. I could walk through SharePoint Designer, and I could build an external content type against SQL Azure using the external content type, just that wizard, and it works out of the box. You do need an app ID, and again, we'll walk through that tomorrow morning, but the point is, there's a native way to do it. Also, for the folks that are more non-code in the room, you can take SQL Server reporting services and natively integrate SQL Azure with reporting services, right? And so literally, it's just, again, there's a switch of, instead of clicking to SQL Server, I'm basically attaching to a SQL Azure data source and using those credentials to tap into it. But again, similar type stuff. Lots of things that you can do there with regard to this slide. So that said, the third thing, and this is where things get kind of interesting, right? And I know we're kind of running long. I will take a sidebar here for just a second. But what we're doing here is we're, in essence, building out a Windows Phone 7 app that allows us to tap into a SharePoint list. Now, what we're going to be doing here is two things. I'm going to have a service that's running on the server. So on my local SharePoint instance, I'll have this service host that's running, and it's a listener service. Okay? Now, you see me deploy, or at least deploy once. You know that now you can deploy a WCF service into Windows Azure. That's going to be my calling service, OK? Windows Phone will call the WCF service, which will then call the listener service and grab the data from the SharePoint list. All right? Okay, that's kind of like the design of what we're going to do. Before I get there, I had a dare from somebody earlier on this week. We had a conversation. Hey, Steve. So Steve here, we were talking earlier on in the week, and Steve...
It's Max.
Max.
Yeah,
so,
Max rule.
Max. So Steve and I were talking, and Steve is a big iPhone developer. And we haven't done a lot internally on kind of taking our code and migrating it to iPhone developers. And so he and I were talking. I gave him the code for this and asked him whether or not he could actually retrofit it with the iPhone experience. So
it's interesting you say retro, too. Speaking of, I don't know who's worked in some of the Apple tools. Anyway, okay. It worked, just like you said, except for one thing, which I would recommend.
Okay.
So by default, I followed your pattern, created my WCF services, used SOAP to do that.
Okay.
That's where I got into a little bit of a problem on the iPhone. There's no real good support for SOAP, not even like third-party tools or anything. So one thing that you'll want to do is restify your service.
Got it.
And so you can either do it, which is cool with WCF, because it makes it really easy to do that using WCF. Or if you don't already have the code for that service, you can just create a WCF REST wrapper around that really easy.
Okay.
Once you do that, one other thing I'd add, you'll probably want to go with the JSON format in your REST.
Yep.
Then you'll find, if you go to Bing in Safari, right? You'll find a nice JSON parser that you can use on the iPhone open source.
So the question I have, though, is we were focusing on iPhone versus Windows Phone 7.
Right.
What was the experience? Was it more difficult? Was it easier? What was the experience across those two?
I kind of like to think about it as
here's a redirect.
Retro, maybe.
Retro.
Yeah, kind of feels like retro. And while you're doing it, you got to do it on a Mac, which is shiny, and it's made out of aluminum, so it's cool to work on. So if you take a little bit longer, who cares?
So I guess my question, you went through this process, you did both. How do you factor the Windows Phone 7 experience?
Well, the Windows Phone 7 experience is awesome because, first of all, if you've done Silverlight or WPF, you're going to just open up that project and you're going to feel right at home.
Yep.
You're working with a design surface. You got XAML. You got your C# behind it. So it's simple to do. No real learning curve on getting that set up and being productive.
As opposed to Objective-C.
You got it.
So I guess the question is, while I relish this moment of you saying that Windows Phone 7 development was easier, do you want to give up your iPhone? I will give you a Windows Phone 7 right now if you give me your iPhone.
Can you bundle in Zoom Pass or something?
I will give you your contacts later after we review them.
It's a pretty cool retro.
Do you want to trade? What do you think, folks? Should he trade? Come on, yeah. There we go. Let's give Steve a hand.
Thanks, man. I'm going to leave before you change your mind.
Nice. Nice. I guess the point of that was we had the discussion around being able to take this solution and have it reach beyond Windows Phone 7, right? Because while we have to obviously talk about Windows Phone 7 internally from Microsoft's perspective, we realize that there's a pretty big market there for iPad, iPhone, other types of devices, right? And this is an interesting solution where we have a code base that then can be persisted across device and platform, yet you don't have to change all of the code underneath. So with that, I'll kind of walk through some things. If you have any questions along the way, let me know. Again, this is a pre-built application. I do have a blog on this, so I'm happy to resurrect that as well. So let's go ahead, let's kill this guy and go into our code. So let's kill that, and I think this is it here. So let's take a look at this first. So I've got a couple things here inside of my project. I've got a resources project, which just basically has some shared resources in it. I've got an on-premises server, my listener service. I've got a test app that I'm going to be using to test that out, and I've got my service that I'm deploying into Windows Azure. Now the thing before we get too deep into this, if we think about Windows Azure, one of the key things I have up here is the service bus. Now the service bus is my bridge. It's the connection, okay? Because at the end of the day, I have a service here in the cloud and I have a service here on premise, but how do you connect them? And basically what you do here is you go into the service bus and you create a new namespace, And that gives you the ability to have this namespace with some authentication that actually connects the two, right? Has a key, has a token. I can then actually have my service on premises talking to my service in the cloud and vice versa. Okay? That's essentially the bridge. So if you think about these two things going to two different places, this is how they're talking. So if we go back, we take a look at the resources. Basically, there's just a sales object in here, a custom class. Let me go ahead, sorry, and just beef up the font size. Okay. And we have an operation contract, so that's a fairly simple contract. It's called get sales, so there's only one method in it. If we look at the core or the service here, you can see that there's a couple things. I have my app.config. That contains, I'm not going to pull it open, but you can see it contains some configuration about my service in the cloud and my namespace that I'm going to communicate with. If you look at the actual class that represents my service information, the calling code, you can see I'm using my sales object. I'm using basically standard server object model code, right? Because at this point, the service is actually living on the server. So I can use server object model code to interact with my SharePoint site. Okay? And you can see it's going to call into a list called sales. It's going to grab some title, contact, and some sales information and expose that out to my phone app. Okay? If we look at the core console app program class, you can see here it's just basically creating a new service host of type the class I just showed you. Okay? And so essentially this thing's going to be running, waiting to be called, and when it's called, boom, it's going to go out and it's going to call into my SharePoint site. Now that's kind of the listener service. Okay, if we take a look at the other side of the coin, which is basically where I'm deploying the service, here again we're setting up some resources, and in the console service I had all my configuration, my app.config. Here I've got them in my project resources, right? So you can imagine where you see project resources.service namespace. That's the namespace of my service in the cloud, some token information, just allowing us to, again, to make that handshake so they can talk to one another. Then, of course, I have the URI for the service. I've got to obviously set up some credentials, some binding, and a communication channel. So I've got some objects to do that. And then finally, I open up that channel, and you can see where I've got the list sales, list from on-prem, basically saying take that list collection, make it equal to whatever comes back from the get sales method. And there, I'm just going to return that to the calling application. Okay? So to prove this out, just to basically debug this, the first thing we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll run the service, the on-premises service, which is the listener service. So this will sit here, and it'll start up. It'll have to warm up a little bit here. And once it warms up, you should see a message. There we go. We've got sales data info services now running. Okay, now what I'll do first is I'll run my debug experience, which is basically a nice little, very complicated Windows form app, as you can see. But I go here, click Get Sales. Now what's happening here? This goes out. It calls the service in the cloud, which is then bridging with the service on-prem. And what should happen is we should be getting data from a SharePoint list, and that'll populate that data grid. There we go. Now that data is essentially coming from here. If we go here and go into Sales, this is where this is coming from, right? And you can see that there's some simple information here. We go, and it's the same information there as well. Okay? So this is just a simple on-premises test. The true test becomes when we actually go and begin to build Windows Phone 7 apps or any other type of WCF conversant app. And I think Steve had a great point looking at restifying your app so you can use JSON and kind of be a little more flexible in what you're using and how you do it. Now we can take the same pattern and begin to apply it to a new paradigm. Okay? So let's go ahead. We'll keep that up and running. I'm going to open up my VM. And here you can see I've got a Windows Phone 7 app. Okay? How many people have built a Windows Phone 7 application here? 3 or 4 of you. So hopefully more of you will check it out. Either free tools, you can download it and play around with it. And then if I go ahead and take a look at the code behind, you'll see that it's fairly simple code. You know, we're creating a proxy. The proxy points to that WCF service we've deployed into Windows Azure. And then we're just calling and getting some data. And we're going ahead and we're pulling that back and we're binding it to a control on our Windows Phone 7 application. Okay? The nice thing about Windows Phone 7, we have this nice little emulator that runs. It'll load up here. And so what will happen when it loads up you will get this really cheesy app that's a little button that says Get Sales. I'll be able to click it. It'll go out and call that service and pull the data from my on-premises server, right? So here we're talking about two completely different devices talking to one another via the App Fabric service bus, okay? While this warms up, any questions while this is happening? How do I get around the firewall issue? Great question. And so what's happening? To get around the firewall issue, basically that's the App Fabric service bus. You're creating an instance of a service, and you're basically saying use these credentials from this service bus. That's how you get around the firewall. You're literally leveraging the service bus, which is the connection point between the two services, okay? And so here we have the sales data. I click Get Sales. That will go out. We'll call the service. What we'll do is we'll jump back here, and we'll see when this ticks up. This should say Get Sales Data method called at some point. There we go. Gets it. And then we can go back into our Windows Phone 7 app. Come on. There we go. There was the data. And so then it brought that data back with a remote device, using Windows App Fabric Service Bus. Okay? The point being here, again, I'm not trying to oversell Windows Phone 7. What I'm trying to sell here is the experience of using the App Fabric Service Bus to have remote devices to communicate with your on-premises instance of SharePoint. It's a very interesting scenario that then begins to take all this data that you've got living in your enterprise solutions and pushing that out to other devices, to people that are around the world. Okay? Really is an interesting paradigm that hasn't been explored yet. So this is something that's fairly new. The other thing that we can do is it's not only about reading data, we can also write data. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead. Let's just go ahead and close this down. And I'll go back. And we'll close this down as well. Go back into the code. What we can do is go into our core service file here, into our, I think this is it here. And I can go ahead and uncomment this guy here. And we will go down here and just add in a new, here it is. So basically, I'm cheating a little bit. Ideally, what you would do is you would have some control that would have a user entry that would take some data and pass it back. But all I'm trying to show you is that with the same service, I can just add a method onto it that would then read that data and write data back to it as well, right? So here we have Contoso, Janice, Joplin, blah-de-blah-de-blah. So what will happen is if I go back and I debug this solution again, it'll start up again. There we go. And then I'll go ahead and just use the WinForm app again, just so we don't necessarily have to pull open the Windows Phone 7 app again, and click Get Sales. You should see the sales method call. It'll go ahead, go out to the App Fabric Service Bus, come back. And then what will happen is after it gets the sales data, we should be able to go back into our guy right here, and you'll see that now Janice Joplin is an option there that has been added into the file. So the point is, it's not just about reading, it's also about writing. And you can build apps that actually write back into SharePoint in as much as you can build apps that read from it. Okay? Now, obviously, you'd probably want to be a little particular about security around who writes back into your on-premises SharePoint data, but it can be done. Okay? Any questions on that? Have you guys seen that? Is that something fairly new that, yeah? Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. So let's go back here. This is probably the easiest thing to do. So walking through this, now that you've seen the code, you've seen the applications working, on the left-hand or on the right-hand side, I have my phone. My phone app has a service reference that I'd added to my service in the cloud, right, the WCF service. Okay? That's that guy there. It then, using the service bus, calls into the listener service that's just constantly running, waiting to be called. Okay? Now that it's got a call, it's like, hey, someone's finally calling me and reaching out. I can then go ahead and pull the data from the SharePoint list or write data into the SharePoint list, pull that back, and then pushes it back to the phone. That, in essence, is the process. But the key thing, I think, where you might be tripping up here is the two services, they're connected by the service bus. And really, at the end of the day, just think of it as a channel with like a key and a string. And one service knows the key and the string, and the other service knows the key and the string, and that's the handshake between the two. Okay? It's as simple as that. You can wrap more security around it if you want to, but this demo just uses the token and the key just to prove out the demo works. Okay? Is that fair? If you want to talk more afterwards, we can definitely do that, because I think we should probably move on to our favorite topic of security. So I'm going to ask Donovan to come up and show his demo. He's got a great demo here. But in terms of security, there's a lot of things that we can do with security. This is an example basically where Donovan's going to show you how he federated Active Directory. And what he's done is connected all these different pieces up with a federation provider and a relying party, and basically created a connected example, and he's embedded that as an iframe within SharePoint that allows all these different pieces to talk. And so, Donovan, why don't you go ahead and show your demo?
Okay, I think the first thing, just to come back to this slide just a little bit, is to pull out the fact that there are essentially 3 roles at play here or interacting. And the first role, if we look down on the right-hand side, we have that relying party application. And I've just simply used a web role, an Azure web role, to create a little ASP.NET application that lives out in the cloud. Okay, so it lives out under Azure. That's my relying party application. The second role is what we call the federation provider. That's the access control service in Azure. So with the federation provider is a security token service, and it has the role of being able to take security tokens in from identity providers. We'll talk about that in a second, that it has relationships with. It can take a security token in and trust that token, and then turn around and hand its relying party application, which is the little ASP.NET application. It can hand it a token that it has signed that the relying party can trust. So when we see these lines on here, what we really are seeing is the trust relationships between the different roles. So the relying party trusts the access control service to give it its tokens, and it trusts it because it has a certificate that is going to, that the ACS service is going to sign its tokens with. The federation provider has relationships with other one-to-many identity providers. So in this case, my identity provider is ADFS. So the federation provider has a certificate that's been given to it by ADFS, so it can trust the tokens that ADFS hands it. But then I also have a trust relationship between SharePoint as a relying party to ADFS. So we have a lot of things going on here. But the identity provider role has the responsibility of authenticating that user, going and grabbing information out of AD, packaging that up in a security token, signing that token with its certificate, and handing it off down either to SharePoint or handing it off to ACS. So that's the roles involved: a relying party, a federation provider, an identity provider. And SharePoint also can be considered a relying party to ADFS. So those are the roles that are involved. So what I want to do now is just pop into the demo here and just show you a little bit of how we wire these up. So in this case, I'm in the Access Control Services in Azure, the Access Control Services portal. And here we can see Access Control Service is going to show us, I timed out here, is going to show us where we can configure our identity providers. So in this case, we'll just click on the identity providers, and out of the box, you can very simply have Windows Live ID be an identity provider to your ACS types of applications. There's other identity providers that are really easy to wire up here as well. Now this is the ADFS identity provider, so to wire that up, it's really pretty straightforward. I simply give it a name, and I point to the metadata for the federation metadata for ADFS. And what's the federation metadata? It's just an XML file that describes everything about ADFS, the claims, the attributes that it can provide in its security tokens, as well as the certificates that are needed to be trusted. So we point to that metadata, and then ACS is going to pull that in. The other thing we let ACS know is where is the endpoint to be trusted for ADFS. What is the security token service endpoint? So we give it the endpoint to be trusted, and that's it. Everything else that needs to be known by ACS about ADFS is in that federation metadata. So it's really simple. We click save, and the magic happens behind the scenes. An identity provider, it's just that easy to set up an identity provider with access control services. Now we can look at our relying party application. So as we saw down in the lower right-hand corner, our ASP.NET application needs to trust ACS. So here is where we describe how we trust that relationship. So for ACS, we let it just give it, this is just for management capabilities here, just to be able to see the name. But we say, tell ACS where the endpoint is for the web application and give it this return URL. We tell it what type of security token it can handle, and in this case, it's a SAML11 security token. No other specific pieces of information other than what we do here is we say, this relying party application wants to receive claims or information from the identity provider Contoso. So ADFS, people at Contoso, through that ADFS trust relationship, can pass claims or tokens on, or claims on into the relying party application. Okay, so we'll cancel out of that. There's one other thing that's important here, and that's rule groups. So in this case, we can simply define which specific pieces of information we want to pass through to our relying party application, which specific claim values. And in this case, we are just simply saying, okay, from the identity provider, we're going to pass in a common name claim. We're going to pass in a name. We're going to pass in roles. So this might be all the groups that this individual belongs to in ADFS. And then we'll come back to this one in just a little bit. So very simple on the ACS side to describe what relying parties are going to trust it, as well as what identity providers are going to be trusted. So that's the ACS side. So now let's just pop over here real quick to the ADFS side. So ADFS, in this case, let me just go ahead and I'll just cancel all that. Just do it this way. So ADFS now, being a security token service that can mint tokens, it needs to be able to know who it's going to trust and pass security tokens to. So in this case, at the very top, that's my SharePoint site. So on my SharePoint web app, on my SharePoint application, in SharePoint, I have a web application that has claims authentication and a relationship with ADFS set up. We'll see that in just a second. So that's SharePoint being able to trust ADFS. But then the second one down is ADFS in relationship with access control service. So both the access control service needs to know about ADFS, and ADFS needs to know about access control service. And this is where we configure that relationship. And in this case, we can just simply look at the claims, and here we can just show the claims that are going to be going across. In this case, ADFS is serving up a name claim, a common name claim, and role claims. And if we just pop in just real quick and do a look at the claims that we're going to pass, what we're saying is, out of Active Directory, pass a name claim, take the display name in Active Directory, pass a common name claim, and then this is just a special way of saying, strip everything off of the group name and only send the string value of every group name and send that as a role claim across to access control services. Okay, so that's the background. So now let's make it all happen here. So let me just close out this. So we'll go to the SharePoint site. This specific FedSPContoso.com is a web application that I have built that is connected up to say this is a claims-based web application, and it is trusting ADFS for its tokens. Okay, so when we signed in here, there was no authentication prompt because we've configured ADFS to use Windows Integrated Authentication. You can use ADFS to use forms-based auth if you want as the default, but in this case, we just simply said, let's use Windows Integrated Authentication. So that's the beauty of single sign-on. It just works. You know, it's a great demo. It just works. So we have single sign-on to this website. User hasn't been prompted for any credentials. So what we're going to do then is now I've simply added an iframe, just like Steve did. I added an iframe to a page. And so now essentially what's happened here is that within that iframe, I am hitting that Azure web-based application, that Azure web application that is trusting tokens from ACS, that has a relationship with ADFS, and I have single sign-on now to that application because all of the trust relationship is established. Notice I didn't get prompted to hit that web application. So this comes full circle then with the ability to have and surface directly into your SharePoint site applications that are hosted out in Windows Azure. And from a user's perspective, it just works. It's just all there. Now there's one last thing that I want to do here, is that what I've done is I've just surfaced all the claims in a window down here. So these are all the role claims that are being passed across. And you can look at those and you can go, well, gosh, those are just group names out of Active Directory, and that's exactly the case. But in this case, what I want to do is say, all right, if I see the domain admins claim, if that comes into ACS, I want to transform that claim and output a manager claim, because managers can have read-write capabilities to this application here. So I'm going to go ahead and come back into my rule groups. And in my rule group, I'll go ahead and open the role claim. And in this role claim, I'm going to say, all right, if you see a claim that comes in called domain admins, I want you to output a role claim that has the word manager in it, because I've built my web application to do special things if a manager role is there. So I'll go ahead and save this, save the rule group, come back to my web application, and now I have changed no code. I haven't reconfigured anything with respect to Active Directory. And yet when I come back into this application now, just because I've configured a claims transformation within ACS itself, now you can see that I have manager capabilities, which lets me edit and delete items in my Azure SQL database. And if I come down here, notice I have the domain admins group, but I also have this new claim called a manager claim. And the beauty of that is the fact that ACS, being the token provider for my relying party application, there might be identity providers out there that can't give me a domain admins type of a claim. But they might be able to give me a supervisor claim. But I can still do that claims transform for that identity provider in ACS, in a rule group for that identity provider, that I can say, take a supervisor claim and make it a manager claim. So that means my web application stays consistent and constant. I write it once. Steve, you're back on.
Great. Thanks very much, Donovan.
Yep.
All right. Yeah.
There's probably a number of points you could do it. I mean, right out of the chute, you could do it at the relying party application itself, okay, where you could track that claim, the manager claim coming in. You'd have to think about at the ACS side, we really don't have the traceability there. So we can talk more about it later.
So it'd be a requirement that I would add.
Yes, you would manage it. But you can also track it on the ADFS side as well.
Okay, so that was great. Thank you very much. Let's go back here. From current slide. Okay, so that was obviously great, very elaborate, and I think with regard to security, Windows, Azure, and SharePoint, we're kind of at the beginning stages of it. We are trying to put some things together internally that'll help you understand best practices towards security. Earlier on, I said it's a bit of a rabbit hole. What I meant by that is you could jump down the rabbit hole and obviously have multiple doors that you could go through, right? So for example, I talked a bit about business connectivity services. You could literally take an external content type, hook it into SQL Azure using an app ID, right? That's one handshake. That would be a security, security method. Another way is using App Fabric, right? You could wrap ACS and with a passive UI, or you could have WS Federated or WS Trust to have a little more code-centric solution. But again, have some sort of claim that then allows you some pass-through with a service-centric solution. Blob storage, again, as I mentioned, is another way of having even a separate set of security access to data within Windows Azure. So for example, if you look at the blob storage bullet there, you can see that you can have shared access permissions. And what that means is I can issue a link that would be live for, let's say, some predetermined time of frame that you would actually define. So whether it be 10 hours, 24 hours, a week, or whatever, you could actually provide people access. And it could be discrete access to a blob, or it could be the container access. So that's another way yet of actually providing access to information in Windows Azure. And again, you can integrate that with SharePoint. The other thing is we have certificates that you could use as well. So I have a trusted certificate that obviously speaks to a service in the cloud, and they have a handshake there. So all that to say, there's multiple ways of actually getting to this place where you could have security. Again, I think the onus is on Microsoft to provide you with a best practices roadmap, and we're working on that now. In the meantime, we're putting together labs and things like that that'll at least help you get your heads wrapped around what security means really in this new world of integrating these two technologies. I wanted to leave you with at least one more thought about Office 365 because I know we're talking about it a lot this week. You look at opportunities in terms of the SMB market. There's a lot of interest there. So when you think about this idea of how do I get engaged, programmatically with Azure and Office 365 and SharePoint Online, just remember that even though you may not have external service calls from those sandbox solutions, there's other things that you can do, right? Again, there's Silverlight, right? There's jQuery, there's JSON, there's RESTified services, lots of things that you could do. You have the SharePoint client object model that works both with JavaScript and with Silverlight, right? So you can interact with certain things within SharePoint. You can also use the service bus, as I showed you before. And of course, you can federate authentication. And you will see lots more information about how you can do some of this stuff. Now, I think I wanted to see if I could show one last demo. Now, we're sitting at about 2 minutes. So I think what I'm going to do is rather than show you the demo, I'm going to post the demo on my blog so I don't keep you here too long. And if you want to come up and talk a little later, we can do that. The one thing I do want you to take away from today, there's two things. There's a teaser book at the back. You can all grab one or a few of them if you want. There's lots there. It's 3 chapters of an upcoming book on SharePoint and Azure. So take it away. I'll get you started. The second thing is we just built this. This is the second version of the SharePoint and Windows Azure Developer Kit. So you can download it. It's free. Get started. There's 8 modules in there. We're going to ship another 4 modules, I think, by the end of June, early July. So we're trying to gradually flesh out this area. You're going to see a lot more activity bringing these two technologies together, okay? Just to forewarn you, as we move forward, obviously Windows Azure is key to Microsoft's strategy. It will factor in very importantly within SharePoint as well, okay? So just consider yourself really early to the game, which is really great, and you'll be well prepared when things start converging head on in not too distant future here. So with that, I think what's next, you could, if you wanted to develop, you could download the SharePoint VM. There's the training kits that you could get started with, the primer that I just showed you. Grab a book at the back, and then come and see us at the Microsoft booth. We'll be around tomorrow afternoon. And if nothing else, enjoy the rest of the week. I really appreciate your time, and good luck with your Azure and SharePoint development.